Hi, everyone. I'm Steve Kep, co-founder and editor-in-chief of From Day One, our forum on corporate values. Welcome to our webinar today. It's titled People First, Performance Focused, Linking HR Efforts to Bottom Line Success. So now before we get started, for today's attendees, that's you, we have some complimentary VIP tickets available for one of our monthly virtual conferences. It's coming up on February 19th. Here's what that one's about. At a time when many industries face talent shortages, talent acquisition leaders can play a pivotal role attracting and retaining hourly workers, finding unconventional pools of talent, taking part in succession planning, and embracing skills-based hiring to meet future workforce needs. So we'll be looking at what are the tools and the new technology, including AI, that can help them. I'm putting a link in the chat space right now to access complimentary VIP tickets for that virtual conference. It includes access to the whole day's activities. The regular price for our conference tickets is $149, so don't miss out on this opportunity, and I hope we'll see you there. Now, today we'll be talking about people first, performance focused, linking HR efforts to bottom line success. People first and performance focused practices are key to organizational growth and measurable success on a global scale. In this webinar, leaders from HiBob will share research on how quality global HR practices drive performance and fuel organizational growth through investments in development, employee experience, and retention. So you'll discover how strategic HR initiatives, from boosting productivity to improving customer satisfaction, translate into measurable success and become the cornerstone of a thriving and resilient company. You'll learn actionable ideas on how to demonstrate the ROI of a people-first approach within your organization. Now, today's webinar is presented with support from HiBob. I'll tell you a bit about them. Bob is a modern HR platform that enables mid-sized businesses to create remarkable work experiences. As the world of work continues to evolve, Bob adapts the business to business needs using unparalleled configurability that can handle everything from remote and hybrid work to global expansions and non-traditional organizational structures. Now, a few quick logistical items, and then we'll get started. The webinar you're watching is being recorded, and it'll be available on demand soon after the event. So you can watch for a link in your email in about 24 hours. That same email will have info on how you can get professional development credit from the Society of Human Resource Management, actually from the HR Certification Institute. And look out for a written account of the conversation on our website at fromdayone.co. We'll have a Q&A session about 45 minutes into the webinar. You can submit your questions anytime you think of them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, with all that said, let's meet today's speakers. Today's conversation among HiBob leaders, Kenneth Matos, Director of Market Insights, and Keren Kozar, Senior People and Cultural Partner, will be moderated by Emily McCrary Ruiz Esparza. She's an independent journalist and From Day One contributing editor who writes about business and the world of work. And her stories have appeared in The Economist, the BBC, the Washington Post, Business Insider, and others. She is the recipient of a Virginia Press Association Award for Business and Financial Journalism. Congratulations, Emily, and please take it away.
Thanks, Steve. Ken and Keren, welcome. Nice to see you again, Ken. We've gotten to work on one of these together. Keren, it's our first time. I'm sure this will go well. Before I start asking you two questions, I'd like for each of you to introduce yourselves. Tell us briefly more about the titles, what's behind the titles that Steve just introduced you under. Keren, we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi. So I am a senior people and culture partner at HiBob. I've been here for almost 2 years, and I've been in the HR space for over a decade. I like to say I'm industry agnostic because I believe that people are people. So I have spanned a variety of industries: the food industry, the music industry, marketing, and now technology SaaS. And I'm really excited to be here today.
Thanks, Keren. Kenneth Matos.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ken. I'm a director of market insights at HiBob. So my background is as an organizational psychologist, and I spent the first 15 years of my career working in either the Department of Defense, researching racial and ethnic harassment and discrimination issues there, at the Families and Work Institute, focused on remote and flexible work research, or at Culture Amp, looking at issues of engagement and growth. At HiBob, I lead all of our research, looking at what's going on in the HR market.
Thanks to you both. All right, let's get started with the poll. If the day one team will put that up. HiBob just wants to hear from our audience members today. If you could just put your attention on this poll briefly before we move forward, that would be great. Thank you so much to everyone. All right, let's get started. Let's look at the market as a whole, the labor market. What are you seeing now? Ken, we'll start with you since you're statistically minded. What are you seeing right now going on in the labor market that is affecting the way employers and employees interact, relate to each other?
Yeah, so I think there's like three big buckets that I experience as really driving a lot of what's going on right now. The first is a lot of sociopolitical upheaval. Everyone is wondering what's going on with government and policy. There's questions of war in some spaces. There's laws being moved. Things that were sort of HR holy grails are now being tipped over. So there's a lot of confusion and questioning in that space. The second is a big technology disruption caused by AI, where people are saying, okay, I used to know what my workforce planning was going to look like, but now am I hiring more? Am I cutting back? Am I changing the nature of people's jobs? Is AI really happening now, or is it going to happen later? I think that's another thing that's really driving a lot of confusion for people. And then third, there seems to be a really strong power struggle between employers and employees as a result of trying to adapt to the first two things of, employers want flexibility and they want employees to give everything they have to the jobs they currently are in, whereas employees are really thinking about how do I get career security and survive in a really dynamic and changing world.
We've certainly seen that with return to office orders that have been issued lately. It becomes a power struggle and a new way of relating to each other. Who gets to say where somebody works? I've certainly observed that in my work. Keren, you're a practitioner in this space. What have you observed changing the relationship between employers and the people they employ?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're here to talk about people first, practices. And I think that particularly when we talk about something like return to office, employees want to understand the methodology behind it. They want to make sure they're being considered as people. So when we think about something like return to office, which, a lot of us in the HR space are dealing with right now, it's all over the news. You have some of those big organizations saying we're wanting you to come back 5 days a week. And I think that the best way that you can make sure that you're thinking about your people is that you are thinking about how it's going to impact their day-to-day life. I always say that with an office hybrid remote setup, you are going to find employees who want whatever is best for the company. So it's most important that leadership is saying this is going to be our philosophy about return to office. We trust that we will find talent. And of course, there's all the statistics around the talent market and, the accessibility of talent. If you're remote, of course, yes. But you're going to have companies always that say it is important for us to have an office culture. That being said, talk to them about why you're doing those things, the impact you're going to see. It's not just, we believe that you're going to be more efficient at work, because people have been efficient at home. I'll use a really great example. So there is a company that is going back 5 days a week. They gave everyone many months' notice, and they didn't think about how this was going to actually completely upheaval people's lives. For example, when you think about something like childcare, people had to find new daycare centers for their children. Maybe they were in a place that was 9 to 5. Those are working hours. But now when they're factoring in a commute, all of a sudden it needs to be an 8 to 6 place. And then 2 weeks before the return to office, it was, we actually don't have enough desks. We're going to be pushing this out a few months. Employees were understandably upset. Now, when you think about it, they were given many months' notice. Of course, that is thinking about people, but you have to also count the desks. You have to think, how are people completely changing their lives when we make decisions at the top? And if you're not thinking about that, then it's really hard to say that you stand behind a people-first organization.
I just did a story on return to office and something that not only failing to count the desks, failing to account for the culture that people are welcomed back into and putting the company first rather than the work environment that employers are going to be actually existing in. Ken, I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I think it's also really important to keep in mind there's a lot of stories about big monster companies doing this, but there's also research showing that the overall average, if you count companies, not size of company, has been pretty flat for a long time. Like there is no sign that there's a giant end to remote work, just at the like megacorps that actually shift their local economies.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're saying that for every giant company that's going back to an in-office philosophy, there are lots of companies that are saying it's absolutely not worth it for us to be in office. We're going to stay remote. And so the data is staying flat. What we're seeing in the tail end of 2024 and moving into 2025 is that companies are now being forced to make a decision. So it was, prior to that, the world was making the decision for us. There was a pandemic and everyone really, a lot of people had to go remote. Companies were being reactive to that. We're now in a position where companies are saying we're no longer reactive. We are going to take a stance. And how is that going to impact our people? What are going to be the business consequences of that? And what's going to be the talent consequences of that too?
So it sounds like neither of you think smaller companies that fly under the radar simply because of their size or revenue, that are publicly listed with 30,000 employees. It sounds like neither of you feel they're going to try to point to something like a JP Morgan or an Amazon and say, if they're going back, we're going to go back. They seem to be more independently minded. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think, oh, sorry. I don't think you can paint with as broad a stroke of that. There are absolutely going to be organizations that say, well, look, they're doing it. We should absolutely be doing it too. There are going to be lots of companies that can't afford to go back to an office for what they're not going to see as a high ROI. So I think it's more about leadership, making the decision about what they want for their company. And like I said, just explaining the reasoning behind it to the people.
I think the key thing is to not see the big companies as the bellwether of what is best practice. I think they are making a very specific set of decisions that tie into like what they are, the size they are, the kinds of markets they play in, the employees they have, and everybody's doing the same thing. And it's not all turning to everybody now has to come back to the office. To Keren's point of being like strategic about what are you trying to do, what's the culture you want, what's the cost of real estate that you're playing with? I think that's really powerful. It's also possible we'll see a reversal when organizations' real estate commitments, that's what I was looking for, real estate commitments end. They may say like, oh, actually we saved a lot of money. Let's go back and like phase out some of our stuff. So I think a hard turn now doesn't necessarily predict the long-term future.
What are the most exciting changes that you expect to see to the standard HR practices upcoming in 2025? Keren, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah. So Ken talked about AI a little bit, and I would say that that is already and going to continue to be a huge trend that we're going to see. Our CEO likes to say that AI is not going to replace jobs, but people who know AI are going to replace jobs of people who don't. It's a tool that needs to be leveraged, and the automation that it affords people, the time saving is going to be huge. So I would say that what we're going to see is companies leveraging this new tool that is available to them. So companies that are saying, I don't want my employees to have access to AI, I think it's cheating, right? We're seeing some of that where they're creating policies that say, we don't want you using, ChatGPT to write policies. I say, why not? You obviously need to be there using it, editing it. But when we do surveys, I absolutely am inputting that survey data into AI and I'm saying, help me analyze this. I'm not saying analyze this for me and then blindly trusting it, but help me analyze it. And the time that I'm saving on things that otherwise would be really manual, allow me to be a more strategic partner to my leaders and to the business.
I think that really highlights the need to think about what are modern skills that people need to be successful in the workplace. So like, who have the temptation, as Keren pointed out, to like hit the buttons, have it spit something out and forward it on to the next person in your production chain. When really what you want to train people to do is be critical thinkers, can really consume information intelligently and say, okay, I am an expert in whatever it is I'm doing. This spit out a draft really fast. Let me edit that draft as though I were managing an employee and not as though it's replacing me. And I think that transition, really pushing people to think of themselves that way, is empowering. If you leave it as this, you and the machine are equivalents, then you've got a recipe for a lot of frustration and probably a lot of disappointment.
I've never heard someone put it that way, Ken, the way you just did. editing something, for instance, that generative AI has produced and treating it like you're managing a person, for instance, and just being part of your duties. It's not a substitute. I think that's a really, really, really good way of describing it. So AI is not a small investment. Obviously, you can do a free version of Chat GPT. There's all these freemium versions of different tools, but companies they need to protect their data, their internal data. So they're basically white labeling or paying a lot for these tools, and they're not small investments. So how do you determine whether adopting a tool like AI and inputting it into your workflows, how do you know if that change was worth it versus just a whim from a leader going, everybody else in my industry, or really everybody else in the United States, in the Western world, is using a generative AI. We should be doing it too. How do you know if it was a good business decision or the whim of a business leader? Ken?
So I think the first thing is to really understand what was your theory of change for AI. So like, I'm putting in AI, it should be moving what parts of my organization in what ways to create what outcomes. Also, what was it that made me put AI in the first place? Was it somebody complaining about time? Was it a headcount issue? Like, why did you engage? Can tell you a lot about the outcome you want to see at the end. And what you want to do is create a vision of like, how does putting in AI change that outcome at the other end of the world? Once you have that, you can then move into, okay, how do I measure that that's happening? How do I measure whether or not people are using it? How do I measure what they're producing, how it's getting consumed? You're not going to get everything. I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. If they can't measure every single piece of the chain, they just sort of throw their hands up. I think really if you know what that chain's supposed to look like, you can pick key places where there are doubts or possibility for failure and focus on measuring those bits. And if the end result is what you're looking for, then odds are the whole thing worked. If it's not, then the information you're getting at those key success or failure points can allow you to make some tweaks. And so that allows you to be able to say, like, we set out to have this be different. Either more stuff would be produced faster, fewer people would be needed. The people we need will do more things and not be stressed. You can then say, did the engagement scores go up or down? Did the number of things change? And that allows you to start turning, qualitative ideas into actual numbers that you can measure and talk about.
So treating it as a scientific hypothesis to be tested almost.
At the end of the day, all analytics and all the metrics that we use is just a manifestation of the scientific method.
So how have HR practices adapted to changing needs in this last year? What changes have we already seen occurred? And which ones of those do you think, Keren, will be really long lasting?
Yeah. So another big topic of conversation right now in the HR space is incivility. So, we have in the last few years seen lots of changes across the globe in American politics. It is more divisive than ever, and we are obviously seeing that bleed into the workforce. So something that we have been seeing, and we're absolutely going to continue to see, is how companies, and particularly HR professionals, manage that in the workplace. It really gets coupled with a conversation of work-life balance, the blend of the two. HiBob recently did a speaking tour around Gen Z and the asks that they have of organizations that they work for. They want the values to align. So when you talk about this growing trend of companies aligning to the values of their people, or rather people aligning to the values of the companies that they're choosing to work at, what does that mean in a world that's more divisive than it's ever been? So you're having companies that are saying, I'm going to plant the flagpole here, and this is our stance, these are our values, and we're not wavering from those. But I am also seeing a lot of companies saying, we are actually going to be completely politically agnostic. We are not going to take a stance on absolutely anything, because no matter what we do, we are going to anger some people. I don't believe that there's a right or wrong way to go about this, by the way. But I will say you're going to see companies on either end of the spectrum. And I think where companies tend to fail is when they don't actually choose to be on either end of the spectrum. When they say, I'm going to speak out about this, sometimes it's kind of a statement of a lot of nothing. I'm going to be quiet on some other things. That's where you start losing trust and credibility with your people.
I did a story last year, as in 2024, about this very thing, which is companies forming these cross-functional group called social issues working groups, where they're doing just that. They're sitting down and saying, these are our company values, and therefore, if this were to happen publicly, we should step in and say something. But because X, Y, or Z is really not part of our values, our business doesn't affect that in the world, we're going to refrain from speaking. And the ones who've done that reported being really successful and getting into fewer sticky situations and disappointing their employees less, because they've made it very clear, like you said, what they will and will not be involved in. And I think that's been really effective for a lot of folks. Keren, you also brought up Gen Z and that and how their values are affecting their presence in the workplace. So what are the implications of what we have now 5 generations in the workplace at once? What do you see that doing to the way companies are functioning?
Yeah. Ken and I actually had a really fascinating conversation around generations recently. So, Ken, I know you have a lot to say on this too. What I will say is 5 generations in the workforce for the first time in, arguably ever, really long time, has been having fascinating implications on the workforce. And I think a big contributor to that is the dot-com boom. So when you have millennials who are entering the workforce, they remembered a time that their parents had the desk phone, they left work at work. And so I say we because I'm a millennial, we're entering the workforce where, for the first time, we were accessible all the time. We were available all the time. And we were figuring out what work-life balance was, because at the time it was balance, actually, right? We were just learning what it meant to have a smartphone and to have email that isn't just in your office. But we remembered a day where that didn't exist. You now have Gen Z who's entering the workforce. And for a lot of them, their parents actually entered the workforce during the dot-com boom and didn't have that same kind of situation. And so you're having someone who's always been accessible, who's always plugged in, coupled with someone who remembers what it meant to have a true separation of work and life. Now, you would think that for Gen Z, never having had that they would actually want to be accessible all the time. It's the opposite is what we're seeing. There's a growing trend of them saying, because I'm accessible all the time, there needs to be stronger boundaries of when you're reaching out to me and when I'm on and when I'm off, which is a wonderful thing. So we are seeing kind of a push and pull between different people and expectations of what it means to have that blend of work and life. The other side of that too is that because there is very little blend, social media is entwined. You follow your friends on work and you follow your company on social media, whatever it is, you do want to see that values alignment. So if you're giving so much of yourself to your company and your day-to-day, you kind of want to feel like there's more to it than just a paycheck, that there is a values alignment.
And what would you add?
I'm always a bit back and forth on generations, largely because I've seen a lot of these things developing over time and have been much more in the mindset of like, this is where our society has been going. So I remember, the email transition and a boss being like, just pick up the phone. Like, why aren't you talking to them? Why are you sending an email? I'm just like, because we're working asynchronously. Isn't that faster than forcing a meeting? And so I'm just like, is that really that different than like, why are you texting instead of sending an email, or like doing a bunch of different things? Also, a lot of the work-life transition has been happening as part of the move from being able to do anything anywhere to doing everything everywhere. And so there was like a moment where we were like, oh yeah, now I can work from home. It's a possibility, and I'll use it in these extenuating circumstances. Now, and then once bosses were like, wait, you can work from home? Great, you can now work all night long, was well before Gen Z. Like Boomer and Gen X and millennials were talking about that pain point 10 years ago. And so I think what has changed is the economy has shifted such that people don't really trust that hard work is going to keep you safe. And so I think our youngest workers who feel like they have the least to lose are like, if you're showing me that I'm not going to get more for giving more, I just won't.
I am a millennial, kind of bang in the middle of the generation. My first desk job, I had a desk phone. and accessed email only at my computer on site. And the very next job, my employer handed me a cell phone and was basically like, pick it up or else.
Yep.
So it was very different, but because the times were just changing, you roll with it. And it's only in looking back, you think, wow, they were able to reach me at any time. And it just set a new precedent. So Keren, when we started this conversation, you brought up people first HR. And of course, that's part of the title of today's session. Could you define for us what people first HR is, and then what's the alternative? We'll start with Keren and then Ken.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it okay if I actually go back to the last question real quick? Because there's one other thing
Sure, please.
for that.
Yeah.
The other trend that we're seeing is around leadership and the different style of leadership. And it's interesting when you think about it, because we're also seeing, I think about this because I'm a parent, so it's very front of mind, but we're seeing a big shift in parenting philosophy right now with, gentle parenting, all that's a big topic of conversation. And in a similar way, we're actually seeing that in the workplace too. We're seeing employees expect more of their leaders to be leaders, to be mentors, guidance, and not just managers. Whereas, 20 years ago, that was less of an expectation. And so when we think about the people who are coming into the workforce, they are really expecting a leader who genuinely cares about them and genuinely wants to see them be successful in the workplace. That ties into what you're talking about with people first, because genuinely what it means is that you are considering your people. They're not just a number. We all have the same goal, which is to have a thriving company, right? Every single department wants to contribute to a thriving company. That's going to mean different things for different people. Absolutely. So for some people, that 100% means the bottom line. For some people, that is going to mean having an industry disrupting product. But at the end of the day, happy, engaged employees who feel like they are contributing to an organization that cares about them are going to be the most successful. And that is how a company is going to thrive. So when you think about the decisions that you're making, you want to make sure that you are considering your people. I always used to say this to a previous leader. He was a 100% numbers guy, bottom line only. And he used to say, HR, you're so touchy-feely. And my response back would be, people are a measurable metric. They matter. That is a data point. People's feelings are actually a data point. You need to consider it just like you would consider absolutely any other analytic that factors into your business decision. Ken, I can see you nodding because I'm speaking your language with the metrics and the analytics. And it's true. People's feelings are absolutely something you should be measuring. And I don't necessarily mean measuring 100% within an engagement survey, but I mean that should be a consideration in any decision that you make.
I think so much of what people who pull away from a people first perspective don't realize is how feelings change the effectiveness of their business. I think when I've had conversations with people where I'm like, this is what breaks, they go, aha. So like, for example, just conversation friction goes up. Think of all the times you've avoided completing an email because you just didn't want to talk to that person. That slows down your business function. Like, think of, I did a talk to a bunch of leaders and they were saying like, why do I have to care about my employees' motivation? I don't make them motivated. I'm like, no, but you make them demotivated. So like, there's a lot that you do that can strip away their natural desire to do their job, from micromanaging to disrespect to not being communicative. All of these are things under your control that either speed your business or shut it down. And you can measure all of those things. I think the other piece that I'd like to always flag for people is growth and change and people first tend to go together. Creativity, innovation, doing something new and different. You love your people because they have sparks of ingenuity. When you've switched to, oh, we're in a scarcity mode, we need to cut costs, suddenly people are a cost. They're not an asset. They're a thing that is dragging your business down, and then you start cutting, but then that remains a thing they remember, and they don't necessarily snap back to the other version instantaneously. And so organizations need to be thoughtful about, yes, you may need to cut costs, but how you do that matters, not just the fact that you do or you don't.
And I think a lot of it is building trust with your employees by showing that you're willing to listen to them. Employees, they want transparency, they want communication, they want to understand the why. And when there isn't the why, they're going to draw their own conclusions. And a lot of times they're much worse than if the company was forthright about what decision they're making. I always say the only thing worse than not asking people their opinion is asking and then doing nothing with it. So if you're going to ask employees, for their opinion and you're going to show that you're a listen, you also have to turn around and show them what you're now doing with that information. But just that act of listening and acting on the feedback that you're getting is going to mean that you're working for a people first organization. You can't always act on absolutely everything. You can always show that you're actively listening.
Talk about HR and the bottom line, aligning with business goals. Keren, how can HR do a better job with this? So, for instance, what relationship should HR leaders be forming across the organization? What kinds of meetings they need to be having on a regular basis? Your take?
Absolutely. So figure out what the business goals are, and then make sure that you have a seat at the table and that your goals are aligning back to those business goals. I also like to say, back to what Ken talked about with motivators, find out what motivates the leaders that you're most closely partnered with. It's the same thing when we talk about, giving and receiving feedback and communication. You want to speak in a way that is representative of the person you're talking to. Well, it's the same thing. You want to speak to whatever's motivating them because that's how they're going to listen. I also think a lot of times we talk about how to align with leaders and how to communicate with them. It's just as important to make sure that HR leaders are speaking to every level of the business. So make sure that you're talking to individual contributors, your entry level folks. I mean, honestly, the best feedback that I get from people is like the individual contributors, the entry level people that I'm just sitting with at lunch and talking to them. Because that's how I'm going to synthesize anecdotal feedback and deliver that back to leaders in a way that they're not going to get through like an engagement survey.
And what advice would you have for HRs who want to better match up with the business and deliver on that?
I think I'd go back to some of what I was saying in the beginning of thinking about how you measure the effectiveness of things. If you take a moment and say, okay, they want to drive up revenues. How do people affect whether revenues go up or down? Not just that they sell, but how do they sell? How do they communicate? How do they execute the processes that have been put in place? Where can friction enter into the system? They don't like each other. They don't understand how the system works. So they're using it slower or not at all, are all ways in which you can articulate to a leader, like, you want to get sales revenue up. Here are a bunch of enablers or obstacles. My job is to make sure those enablers are maximized. Here's how. And how these obstacles are removed. Here's how. And that aligns it to what they're trying to achieve. And then it's like, oh, okay, you're my ally. You're not this person who's making me do stupid forms and stopping me from getting on another sales call.
I want to remind our audience that we'll be taking questions for Ken and Keren in about 10, 12 minutes or so. So if you have questions for them, put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do as many of those as we can. And I appreciate it. So let's talk about demonstrating ROI. Both of you have already addressed that this is possible, but not always straightforward or easy. So how do you demonstrate the parts of return on investment that are harder to quantify? Keren already talked about getting anecdotal feedback from individual contributors. But how do you evaluate the culture that are not so easily reflected in something like a pulse survey?
So, wait, I'm sorry, the sound has cut out.
Yeah, Emily, for me as well, your connection's not great. It's a little jumpy.
Okay. Can you hear me at all right now?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, I'm so sorry about that. The demonstrating ROI, the parts of return on investment that are harder to quantify, something that's not reflected in a pulse survey.
So one thing you can do is first start with what are people talking about. So very often things are not moved through metrics, they're moved through conversation. And so if you align with like, okay, there's a lot of complaints about this aspect of our culture, you're able to say, let me start working on it and see if those complaints change or if the conversation shifts. That can be a bit subjective, but if you and your leader are tied into the right communication frames, you're able to say, okay, leader, we did this stuff. Is what you're hearing shifting? Because that can be enough for them to say the work you did was worthwhile. Not everything has to be hard metrics and numbers. You just need to be able to get everybody on the same page that things are moving. The other thing I would add is a lot of times people think of the Pulse survey as always engagement. You can do surveys about a lot of different things. I once worked with a company on understanding their culture for innovation. And what we ended up finding out was they were a finance company that was very compliance driven, and they wanted innovation out of their tech department. And the tech department said, you drown all the innovation in compliance rules. So we do nothing. And so they were able to be like, oh, let's fix that. And they created a whole process specifically for that group to be more innovative without getting shut down by their usual compliance processes. And that just took asking a different set of questions than they would in an engagement survey.
I agree with that. I think, we so often talk about hard metrics and analytics, but I think some of the most valuable feedback has been subjective and anecdotal and acquired through one-on-ones and roundtables. And I think what's actually most important is that you have many different ways of communicating with your employees and gathering that feedback. So yes, of course, engagement surveys. I love engagement surveys, but I'm getting just as much feedback from one-on-ones with leaders. Like I said, just talking to employees. We do roundtables a lot. I'm a big fan of roundtables. So getting small groups of employees together, asking them questions in a similar way that you would to a pulse survey, but it gives you the ability to ask questions and have conversations with them. You can still synthesize the data that you get back, keep it anonymous, all of that. Those only work if you're building trust with your employees. And so you have to do the work at the beginning to make sure that your employees trust you and they want to open up to you. And I think the way you do that is showing them that you are an advocate for them and that you're a person too. I mean, HR should not be some scary entity that sits in the corner of the office and you only hear from them when something's wrong. Like, you should absolutely be out there, be friendly, talking about your life, like showing them that you are motivated by the same things that they are. I always say when people come to me about money conversations, for example, people are always so nervous to come to me to talk about money. Always start off with the same thing. You work for money. I work for money. We all work for money. Of course, there can be absolutely other things that motivate you in your day to day. But just saying you work for money, I work for money, kind of helps them lower their guard down. People come to me, they talk about childcare. I have 2 kids. You're right. My morning was an absolute mess and I was 5 minutes late to my meeting today too. Like, we're both just people working together. And that's how you're going to start hearing what you really need to hear in order to have actionable feedback.
So something that I'm hearing from HR leaders that they're increased on company culture. So not just when and where people do their work, but whether they feel valued or listened to, Keren, what you just described, and connected to company leadership as well. So what are the most consequential actions that HR can take to influence the culture within a company?
So I think it was that question to me, broke up a little bit still.
Yeah, go. Why don't you start, Keren?
So I think that, again, building trust with your employees, showing that you can act on feedback. They often say that culture is what you're willing to accept within your organization. So if you have values, make sure that they are not just something that's on a wall somewhere and never talked about and not the lived reality of your employees. If your values are not the lived reality of your employees, make sure you're doing something to change that. Make sure that you're talking to your leadership to change that. Ask yourself, what doesn't sit right with me, but we're willing to accept, and then figure out why you're willing to accept that. For example, if you have a leader within your organization who's not representative of your values, but you're not working on some kind of plan with them, whether giving them additional support or exiting them out of the business, ask yourself why, dig into that, dig into who's making that decision. Really question what you're willing to tolerate, because that is going to be your culture. No matter what you say out loud, the lived reality of your employees, that is the culture. So of course, yes, you can have happy hours and you can have people be friendly with each other and you can build a foundation in that way. But what people are most concerned about is, who am I working next to on a day-to-day basis? And do they make me feel good about working here?
I agree with everything Keren just said. I would elaborate. I would take it another angle in that there's a lot of values that people don't talk about. And they wouldn't even call them values. So it's like, is it better that I be fast or that I be 100% accurate? Like, are a few mistakes okay? Or does it have to be by this deadline? Those are the kinds of things that like you don't say out loud, but they drive the day-to-day experience and the culture on a very visceral level for employees. And so there's like the big values that you put up on a wall, and then there's all these little values, and being able to articulate those very clearly and say like, at this organization, we'd rather you err in this direction over this direction is actually really empowering for people, because then they can make decisions without leaders having to micromanage each piece and then deal with all the problems that come from that.
A really tangible
So
thing that, oh, sorry. A
Go
really
ahead, Karen.
tangible thing that we did in another company once was we had everyone create user manuals for themselves. So we had people talk about how they like to give and receive feedback. What's a common misconception people have about them? Like really quite a vulnerable document. And you were tasked with sitting down with your manager and if comfortable sitting down with your team and really talking about that. And that was a level of inclusivity that I find is not often achieved at companies. And that's an example of kind of, Ken, what you're talking about. Like it wasn't a value on a wall necessarily, but it showed we genuinely care about who you are as a person. We're invested in making sure that you feel included here. And we want this to be a great place to work.
So as we enter 2025, what kinds of questions and concerns are you hearing from your clients? And then Keren, from the people within your organization as well, what's on their minds for this year? We'll start with Ken.
So I would put it in terms of like chaos and crisis. So chaos is just lots of change. There's, as I said, there's all these things happening and people are pivoting over and over again. And so employees are getting really tired. The HR team is super tired. And so there's a real need for support around not just change management, but like continuous change management. And how do you tell people exactly enough that they feel like they can keep moving forward, even though they know that like, all right, I'm gonna take 5 steps forward and they're gonna make me take 6 steps back and then they're gonna make me turn left. And that's okay. Like, I think the lack of certainty makes people question, am I going to get a good review? Like, what's going to happen to me if I'm constantly pivoting and readjusting, and how am I getting judged? So I think that's like one half. The other one is just crisis. I think the world is going through a lot of stuff, and HR becomes the place where all of those things get solved, or at the very least managed. And so I think a lot of HR people are really struggling with both change and like helping employees and leaders deal with a sense of intensity, urgency, and threat that like, the entire globe seems to be experiencing right now.
Yeah, I would say HR, we're not paper pushers
Keren,
anymore. We are wearing so many hats, and especially COVID really pushed us into this position of being on the corporate front lines. So we are tasked with sometimes being therapists, sometimes being teachers, sometimes being party planners, sometimes being paper pushers, sometimes being lawyers. I mean, my gosh, like the amount of degrees that I should have just in a day-to-day. And one day I can wear all of those hats multiple times. So when we think about, how can HR professionals be successful, especially as they head into the next year, it's really about being agile and being flexible and, leveraging all the different strengths that you have and learning from those around you too. And I also want to stress taking care of yourself, because that is a lot for one person or small teams or whatever it is to be balancing all of that. And there's really very, very rarely someone taking care of HR. HR is taking care of all these different parts of the business. And so rarely do we have people taking care of us. So we have to take care of each other. And I think things like this and networks that come out of events like this are really important to your success.
Well, we have a lot of really good questions from our audience, probably more than I've seen in a lot of these webinars. So congratulations to the two of you. You've got people thinking a lot. So we'll begin with this question from an audience member, Derek, who asked and program managers help executives consistently communicate company goals when executives sometimes deliver mixed messages about the company's path and culture?
I think there's probably a couple different things in there. One is being able to process like exactly where the messages are getting mixed and parsing out like, okay, these things are pretty consistent. So like, let's all start with these things have been said 5 times consistently the same way. Those are true. And then unpacking where the inconsistencies are. Sometimes it's just things move. Sometimes it's different ways of saying it and helping people parse like, oh, he meant the same thing, but like it was a different way of saying it. Versus, the mission has changed or this is going on in the environment. I think one of the things a lot of employees miss is what drives a decision. There's a customer I once worked with where employees were just really upset that they had invested in a big advertising campaign rather than some material need they required. But when you talk to them, like that advertising campaign is going to bring in twice as much money to invest in that material desire that they have than if I just spent on that directly. But they never told them that. So I think being able to unpack the reasoning of shifts can really help people.
I would also say I am a lover, a believer, and a practicer of radically candid feedback. So if you have a leader who is saying their values are one thing, and then in practice or in speech, it just doesn't align, I think you absolutely have to have a conversation with that leader privately, one-on-one, and help them understand, the impact of that. They may not know, right? They may absolutely believe that they are living the values. It's a very difficult conversation to have, but it's important. They need to know the impact.
Thanks for that question, Derek. Our next one comes from Eden, who asks, do you have any further reading or resources you would recommend for HR folks to be better educated on the future of AI and its implementation in the business?
Ooh, there's a lot going on in AI. It's hard to tell what is really useful. Honestly, I think a lot of it, I would just start with the basics of what is AI and how does it function? Because I think a lot of people just don't understand what it does. And once you understand that, a lot of its potential starts making a lot more sense. So I would start by looking for resources that just explain the mechanics of it. You don't need to go super deep and be able to code it, but being able to understand its basics will be powerful.
I also think talk about it with each other, normalize it. I mean, not even like 6 months ago, I was afraid to tell people I was using AI in work. It felt like cheating. And then yesterday, I used AI to help me build out an internal comms. And when I sent it to my boss, I was totally forthright. GPT and I did this together. I prompted, I edited, we did this together, and it was a great comms. So there was no reason to hide that. So talk about it with your coworkers, because then actually you talking about it is going to give you ideas. Some of the best ideas that I've gotten has been from other employees at HiBob saying, this is how I've utilized it. And I'm like, that's a great idea. I'm going to do that too.
Actually, use AI to find the specific resources that you would want to use. It's a great starting activity. And it also will prompt you to practice that skill of evaluating, okay, you said this was a good resource. I'm not going to read that resource. Did your summary actually line up with what it said? What should I be looking for in terms of how you vary? So I think that's actually a really powerful exercise.
And it'll prompt you too, by the way. So if you put in engagement survey results and you say, can you please analyze this data? It'll do some analytics and it'll actually give you 2 questions and say, do you want me to calculate a sentiment score? Oh, yes, I would like you to do that. And it'll just keep kind of going and going.
Our next question is, what lessons can small organizations learn from large-scale global HR strategies?
Data management. I think one of the things that small organizations really have the opportunity to do is build their data infrastructure now so that they can do the work while it's a small lift. I've seen so many organizations put it off. And by the time that they really need big, complex stuff, they've just got accrued too many errors or multiple ways of doing things. And so look to the big organizations for like how they set that stuff up, and just set it up that way from the beginning.
I cannot agree more with that. Absolutely. I also think look at what kind of processes large organizations have. So an example that comes to mind is an internal mobility process, which so rarely do small organizations have something like that. But before you know it, you're going to get from small to medium, medium to large potentially, right? And so start thinking about those now. Even if you take a process and you change it to reflect the size of your company now, a lot of those are public too. So you can Google them. They're widely shared.
I would also add, you don't necessarily need to do the thing. Looking at what they're doing can tell you what you should be thinking about. So like, is this happening in some way at our organization? Do we like it? Do we not like it? But just being able to have that, all those structured policy guides frame out, this is what I should make sure there is a way that we do this, can really help you just feel confident in what you're doing.
Okay, next up. Most first steps for transitioning from a traditional HR approach to a people first model.
Ask the question, how is this going to impact our people? Always. I mean, even if you're not asking it out loud, you need to be asking it to yourself. How is this going to impact our people? And then make sure that you have a communication strategy tied to whatever you come up with. That's so important. It's going to show your people that they matter to you. And then the communication strategy is going to make sure that you hit all the right stakeholders and all the right employees to show them that they were considered. That it's such an easy question. You should ask it every single time.
I'm just going to agree.
Okay. Next up, can you share specific examples of HR practices that significantly boosted organizational productivity?
One thing I would say is like standard operating procedures for a lot of things, even small things. So saying in orientation, for example, I will say we are a Slack first organization, Slack first, email second. I've worked at companies that's email first, Slack second. That way people hit the ground running. They know exactly how we operate, and we can help them get set up with some organizational tools around that. We're a Zoom first organization, camera on. You just like being upfront about things like that right from the beginning kind of levels the playing field. Everyone sort of knows what they're supposed to be doing.
There's also a lot of organizations that have really taken a look at how they do their engagement processes and measured that against like turnover costs as well as the actual productivity of different groups. One of the things that's really helpful is if you have two groups that are getting slightly different experiences and being able to check their productivity. So you first have to have a productivity measure. So this is easiest in sales or manufacturing, where you don't do the same things for both. You do a slow roll up and you're able to say, okay, the one that got this first is having better sales results or better manufacturing with fewer errors. And that at the end of the day, the other one is not. When we add it in, they've gone up. That's a really great way to show that the productivity changed as a result of those initiatives. If you do everything for everyone immediately, you sort of wash away your ability to show that information.
Okay, next up, this attendee wants to know about common misconceptions of the role common misconceptions about the ROI of people first HR practices.
I think there's a misconception that people first means that your employees are steering the ship, and that makes leaders nervous. And my response to that would be, leaders are steering the ship, obviously, but your employees are the ones who are needed in order for there to be a ship to steer. So they need to be considered as a factor. The other thing I would say is that there's a misconception that it is feelings based. And we talked about that a little bit, but remember that employees are making decisions based on their feelings. And so we need to be making decisions based on their feelings too. And that it does impact, like the misconception is that it's soft, but but show them that it impacts the bottom line. I mean, employees, there's no business without employees. You need them. You need them to be happy, engaged, and productive. So I would just eliminate any kind of misconception that it's soft and squishy. It's not.
I would also add that it's not about keeping everyone forever. A lot of it is really about having a good relationship and a mutually beneficial transaction. And so sometimes people's chapters end and they should leave, and that's okay. It doesn't mean the leader necessarily failed. It doesn't mean the employee failed if the alignment ceases to be present. I think a lot of people think that their job then becomes to make employees happy and keep them forever, no matter what they want or how they're performing. It also doesn't mean you can't hold them accountable to performance. Like, a lot of it, the best people first scenarios are just very clear. They're not necessarily super sweet or nice or merciful, but employees just really appreciate, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, this is how it happens. Great. It's the ambiguity breeds anxiety, and anxiety is what creates most of our problems.
And don't be afraid to say, we screwed up, by the way. Leaders are people, companies are run by people, we all make mistakes. And so a big way to build trust with your people and to show that you're actually a people first organization is to say, you know what, we tried something and it did not work and we're sorry and we're going to pivot in this manner.
Okay, next up, this attendee wants how people first practices help organizations respond to global crises or market disruption. I think this is light of the fires in Los Angeles or even the hurricanes in North Carolina and Florida lately. What does people first do in those situations?
So we actually have had a lot of conversations about that. One of our other HR leaders actually posted recently on LinkedIn, where what you really are in HR is somebody who helps people find resources and benefits and make connections. And so a lot of what people need in those crisis moments are, what do I do today? Where do I sleep? What's going to happen to me if I don't show up to work tomorrow? I lost the computer. Am I going to get in trouble? All of those are things that HR addresses and that are a lot less scary when people know that they can go and talk to you and they will get a human response rather than some sort of cold, well, the computer's lost, now you owe money, or now you're fired, or guess you got to figure it out, but you still got to show up to work tomorrow. A lot of it is simply and it doesn't necessarily mean you have to pay all their costs. It means, hey, you know what? You lost your house. Your quota this year, we're not going to hold you as tightly to, because for half that quarter, you were homeless. You're a great employee before. This is a blip. You'll be a great employee after. And so those kinds of moments are a lot less terrifying for employees and easier for the company to communicate with the employee around when you've had to establish the people first approach.
And carry the weight of finding out the contingency. So don't put it on the employee to keep moving business as usual, right? So at the end of the day, a lot of times the company still needs to function, things still need to move forward. But it shouldn't be the employee's job to figure out how to keep things moving in a situation like that. So allow them to focus on their life, their family, whatever it is, and say, we're going to figure out the business impact here and come back to them with a solution. Hey, we've assigned this project that you're working on to this other employee. If you want to plug in, please feel free to plug in. I actually find that a lot of times leaders just pull employees out when they're facing a personal disaster of any kind of sort. They'll say they shouldn't be focused on work right now. Ask them, actually, if you can, if the relationship is there. Sometimes they want to work. Sometimes that's a good distraction for them. But I think that making sure that the business can move forward without putting that burden on the employee shows that you care.
I wanted to respond very quickly to the question about productivity. It took me a moment to recall a specific example. Working with one organization where they were trying to reduce absenteeism. They were a bank. And so for them, productivity is people showing up and delivering customer support. And they discovered that their problems with a lot to do with childcare. They put in a childcare facility, didn't see any real results. They were going to take it out. They actually talked to employees and realized it was emergency childcare that they needed. They put it in an emergency childcare place, and immediately their absenteeism dropped.
Well, thank you, Ken and Karen, so much for being here. This is such a substantive way to spend an hour. I appreciate your time and your knowledge. I'm going to hand it back to Steve at From Day One, who's playing us out with Oscar music, I'm sure.
Thank you all, Karen, Ken, Emily. Really compelling. The stuff about crises like natural disasters was really a great way to end. And for all you people in the audience, be sure to see Emily's story on that, hot off the presses, on our website. I want to thank HiBob again for their support and all of you who participated today. Before you all sign off, I'm going to drop a link one more time for complimentary VIP tickets for our virtual conference coming up on February 19th. It's about making talent acquisition a strategic part of workforce planning and growth. So on behalf of all my colleagues at From Day One, thanks for participating and stay well. Bye for now.